The WNBA just had the biggest year in its entire history, and somehow, that's exactly why everything is starting to fall apart. On the surface, it looks like a success story. Record-breaking ratings, sold-out arenas, a billion-dollar media deal, mainstream attention the league spent decades chasing. But behind the headlines, something far more dangerous has been unfolding quietly. Not growth, not stability, a power struggle. Because the same league that Caitlin Clark helped pull into relevance is now locked in a civil war with itself. Players versus owners. Owners versus investors. The league versus its own reality. And sitting right in the middle of all of it is one player who never asked to be the center of this chaos, but became the axis everything now spins around. Here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Caitlin Clark didn't just change the WNBA. She exposed it. She exposed how fragile the league really was, how unprepared it was for real success, and how quickly entitlement can replace gratitude when money shows up faster than structure. What looks like player empowerment on the outside may actually be the most self-destructive moment in league history. Because for the first time ever, the WNBA is negotiating like it has leverage, while depending almost entirely on one person to keep the lights on. And once you see how we got here, from near collapse to sudden riches, to resentment, you'll understand why Caitlin Clark walking away is no longer unthinkable. It might actually be the smartest move on the table. But to understand how a league managed to sabotage its own miracle, you have to go back before Caitlin Clark ever stepped on a WNBA court. Because the truth is, the WNBA wasn't healthy before her. It was surviving. And there's a massive difference. Before Caitlin Clark entered the picture, the WNBA loved to sell a very specific story. A league on the rise, momentum building, cultural relevance growing year by year, progress happening quietly, organically, sustainably. That story sounded good. It just wasn't true. Yes, the league had existed for decades. Yes, it had loyal fans. Yes, it had talented players. But financially, structurally, and culturally, the WNBA was still operating on life support, and everyone inside the league knew it, even if they didn't want to admit it publicly. Here's what rarely gets explained clearly. The WNBA has never truly stood on its own financially. For most of its existence, it survived because the NBA carried it. Shared ownership, shared infrastructure, shared marketing, shared resources. The league wasn't independent, it was subsidized. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Plenty of leagues need backing in their early years. The problem is that the WNBA wasn't acting like a league still building. It was acting like one that had already arrived. Behind closed doors, the reality was much harsher. Revenue was limited. Profitability was inconsistent. Teams weren't printing money. They were minimizing losses. And growth wasn't accelerating. It was crawling. Survival became the goal, not dominance. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when survival becomes the baseline, everyone involved starts making short-term decisions. Decisions focused on keeping the doors open today, not building something resilient tomorrow. And over time, that creates a culture where nobody is prepared for sudden success. The league's biggest issue wasn't that it lacked talent or ambition. It lacked margin for error. So when fans say the WNBA was doing fine before Caitlin Clark, they're confusing existence with stability. The league existed, but it wasn't secure. It wasn't scalable. And it definitely wasn't ready for an explosion of attention. Even league leadership knew this. That's why so many initiatives felt cautious. That's why spending was tightly controlled. That's why player demands were often met with, "We'd love to, but we can't afford it." Because most of the time, they actually couldn't. This is where the disconnect started forming. Players saw themselves as professionals deserving of more, and they weren't wrong. But the league they played in didn't yet generate the kind of revenue that could support those demands sustainably. So tension simmered, quietly at first. And instead of addressing that tension honestly, instead of building a long-term plan to grow revenue, align incentives, and prepare for future stars, the league stayed in maintenance mode, hoping gradual growth would eventually solve everything. That hope was shattered the moment real pressure arrived. Because when the world tested the WNBA's stability, it didn't happen in 2024. It happened years earlier. And what the league was forced to do in 2020 revealed just how close everything came to collapsing entirely. And that moment planted the seeds for everything we're seeing now. Because once a league survives its near-death experience, everyone remembers it differently. Some remember sacrifice. Others remember leverage. And that difference is exactly where this story starts to turn. Most fans barely remember the 2020 WNBA bubble. And that's not an accident. Because if more people truly understood what happened during that season, the entire conversation around today's power struggle would sound very different. While the world was shutting down, the WNBA wasn't just facing inconvenience. It was facing extinction. Revenue streams evaporated overnight. No ticket sales. No in-arena sponsorship activations. Broadcast uncertainty. Sponsors pulling back. Every financial safety net disappeared at once. And unlike larger leagues with massive reserves, the WNBA didn't have years of cushion to absorb the hit. This wasn't about cutting costs. This was about whether the league could exist at all. Here's the part that rarely gets discussed honestly. When the bubble season was proposed, participation wasn't guaranteed. Not because players didn't love basketball, but because fear, leverage, and money all collided at the worst possible moment. Players wanted certainty, guaranteed pay, additional compensation for risk. And from their perspective, that made sense. The world felt unsafe. They didn't want to gamble with their health or income. But from the league's perspective, there was no extra money to give. Every additional demand pushed the WNBA closer to the edge. This wasn't negotiation theater. This was a crisis room. And that's where Commissioner Kathy Engelbert enters the picture. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a negotiator staring down the end of the league. Behind the scenes, this wasn't a confident commissioner setting firm boundaries. This was a leader pleading for survival. Engelbert wasn't asking players to help grow the league. She was asking them to help keep it alive. The reality was brutal. If the bubble didn't happen, the league was done. Not wounded. Not delayed. Done. So concessions were made. Guarantees were offered. The season went forward. And on the surface, it looked like a victory. The WNBA survived one of the most difficult periods in sports history. But here's where the long-term damage began. Because everyone walked away from that moment with a different lesson. League leadership walked away believing they had narrowly avoided disaster and needed to regain control before the next crisis hit. Owners walked away believing they had saved something fragile and needed stricter guardrails to prevent chaos. And many players walked away believing they had proven their leverage. That last part is crucial. Because leverage remembered during a crisis doesn't fade when the crisis ends. It becomes expectation. The bubble changed the psychological balance of power inside the WNBA. Players had seen how close the league was to collapse. They had watched leadership bend under pressure. And subconsciously, that moment rewired how future negotiations would feel. From then on, every "we can't afford this" sounded less convincing. Every denial felt less final. Every compromise felt like proof that pushing harder might work again. But what most people miss is that the bubble didn't make the league stronger. It made it more fragile. The WNBA survived, yes, but it also revealed just how thin the margin really was. And instead of treating that revelation as a warning, the league buried it. Quietly moved on. Pretended stability had returned. Meanwhile, unresolved resentment lingered on both sides. Players remembered being asked to sacrifice when the league needed them most. Owners remembered nearly losing everything. Leadership remembered how quickly control slipped. Those memories don't disappear. They resurface later, especially when real money enters the picture. And when money finally did arrive, it didn't unify the league. It split it. Because the bubble wasn't just a crisis moment. It was the moment the WNBA unknowingly trained everyone inside it to see negotiations as a test of will instead of a shared mission. And once that mindset takes hold, growth stops being collaborative. It becomes combative. Which is exactly why the next phase of this story wasn't about players versus the league anymore. It was about owners turning on each other. Because the moment outside money got involved, everything that had been quietly unstable finally cracked wide open. And that's where this story gets much messier. By the time the WNBA emerged from the bubble, the league wasn't unified. It was holding together with duct tape, unresolved tension, and competing agendas that no one wanted to confront publicly. And then the money showed up. When people talk about ownership in the WNBA, they often imagine a single group with shared interests. That's never been true, but it became dangerously untrue once outside investors entered the picture. At that point, the WNBA stopped being one league with one vision. It became three different power centers fighting over the same future. First, you had the traditional WNBA team owners. Many of them operate on tight margins. Some own only WNBA teams. Some rely heavily on NBA partnerships. Their priority has always been sustainability. Keep costs controlled. Avoid runaway spending. Survive. Second, you had NBA-affiliated owners. These groups had more resources, more infrastructure, and a completely different tolerance for risk. For them, the WNBA wasn't just a balance sheet, it was a long-term brand investment. They were more willing to spend if it meant growth, relevance, or leverage. And then came the third group, the one that changed everything. Outside investors. In 2022, the WNBA announced a massive capital injection, $75 million, the largest single financial commitment to women's sports in history at the time. Headlines celebrated it as a breakthrough moment, proof that the league had arrived. But money never comes without strings. To secure that investment, the league gave up 16% equity. That meant outside investors now had a real voice. Not symbolic, not advisory, real ownership. And that's when the internal dynamics broke completely. Because now, every major decision required alignment between three groups with fundamentally different goals. Investors wanted growth and returns. NBA owners wanted expansion and visibility. Smaller WNBA owners wanted cost control and survival. There was no shared definition of success anymore. Revenue sharing became a nightmare. Spending priorities clashed. Long-term vision disappeared. And instead of confronting those conflicts openly, the league tried to manage them quietly, behind closed doors, through policy, fines, and selective enforcement. That's when rules stopped being rules and started becoming weapons. Owners willing to spend more on players, facilities, and travel suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Competitive balance became the excuse. Fairness became the justification. But beneath it all was fear. Fear that uneven spending would expose how divided ownership really was. Because once one owner raises the standard, everyone else has to answer for why they can't or won't. This is where the league's messaging began to crack. Publicly, the WNBA promoted growth, empowerment, and professionalism. Privately, it punished teams that tried to operate like a modern professional organization. And players noticed. They watched owners argue while claiming unity. They saw investments approved in one area and blocked in another. They saw spending labeled necessary one year and illegal the next. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration turned into entitlement. And entitlement, when combined with sudden attention, becomes combustible. The league thought it could manage this ownership civil war quietly while continuing business as usual. But money doesn't stay quiet. It exposes fault lines. It forces decisions. And the more the WNBA tried to suppress internal imbalance, the more obvious it became that the league didn't actually know what kind of organization it wanted to be. Cost-controlled and cautious? Or ambitious and aggressive? You can't be both forever. The worst part is that players weren't given a clear answer either. They were told the league was growing, but shown limits. Told money was coming, but warned to be patient. Told to think long-term, while watching short-term chaos. So when certain owners decided to stop waiting and start spending, the league panicked. And instead of addressing the imbalance honestly, it chose enforcement, which led directly to the scandal that made everything visible. The charter flight controversy didn't just expose hypocrisy. It exposed fear. And once fear becomes policy, trust disappears. That's when players stop listening. And that's when a league loses control of its own narrative. The charter flight controversy wasn't really about flights. That's what made it so revealing. On the surface, the issue looked simple. Travel conditions, player safety, competitive balance. A league trying to ensure fairness across teams with vastly different financial resources. But underneath that explanation sat a much uglier truth. The WNBA wasn't enforcing policy to protect parity. It was enforcing fear. When the New York Liberty were fined $500,000 for arranging their own charter flights, the message wasn't subtle. Spend too much. Move too fast. Raise the standard without permission, and there will be consequences. Officially, the league framed it as a competitive imbalance violation. Privately, it was about control. Because once one team starts operating like a top-tier professional organization, every other team gets exposed. Fans start asking uncomfortable questions. Players start comparing treatment. Owners who can't or won't invest start looking inadequate. And the league wasn't ready for that comparison. What made the situation even more glaring was the inconsistency. In Las Vegas, ownership poured money into facilities, coaching, and infrastructure. Private planes, world-class training environments, championship-level spending, all praised as commitment, all celebrated as growth. So players watched two realities exist at the same time. In one market, investment was rewarded. In another, it was punished. That contradiction destroyed credibility. Because from the player perspective, the league wasn't saying, "We can't afford this." It was saying, "Some of you don't deserve this." And that's when expectations permanently shifted. Players didn't just want better travel anymore. They wanted clarity. They wanted consistency. They wanted proof that the league actually believed in professionalism instead of just talking about it. The charter fine made something painfully clear. The WNBA wasn't operating with a shared vision. It was reacting to pressure moment by moment, choosing control over trust, optics over transparency. And while the league tried to frame the controversy as an isolated incident, it had a ripple effect that leadership completely underestimated. Because players talk. They talk across teams, across locker rooms, across seasons. And what spread wasn't gratitude for fairness. It was frustration with limitations that no longer made sense. At the same time, fans started noticing contradictions too. How could a league claim growth while penalizing investment? How could it celebrate professionalism while restricting the very things professional leagues do? The charter flight scandal wasn't loud, but it was corrosive. It told players that advancement would always come with resistance. It told owners that ambition had boundaries. And it told everyone watching that the WNBA was still afraid of its own evolution. That fear set the stage for what came next. Because when a league spends years telling its players, "We can't do this," and then suddenly does everything overnight, it creates a psychological shock that no amount of messaging can smooth over. That shock arrived in April 2024. And it didn't come from policy. It came from one player walking onto the biggest stage the league had ever seen. A player the WNBA had no plan for. A player who would unintentionally break every excuse the league had been using for years. And once she arrived, there was no going back to how things used to work. April 2024 didn't just mark a new draft class entering the WNBA. It marked the moment the league's entire operating model stopped making sense. When Caitlin Clark's name was called first overall, the reaction wasn't normal excitement. It was a shockwave. Millions of people tuned in just to watch her hold up a jersey. Not a game. Not highlights. Just the announcement. That alone should have been a warning sign. Because no league accidentally stumbles into that level of attention. And no league that's prepared lets it catch them off guard. But that's exactly what happened. The WNBA wasn't ready for a player who could pull mainstream America into a space it had previously ignored. It wasn't ready for someone whose popularity extended beyond traditional basketball fans. And it definitely wasn't ready for a star who exposed how much untapped demand had been sitting dormant for years. Clark didn't just bring viewers. She brought scrutiny. Every flaw the league had managed to keep quiet suddenly became visible. Travel conditions, officiating, marketing gaps, media hostility, player behavior, leadership silence. The spotlight didn't just shine on Clark. It shined through the WNBA. And the league had no shield. There was no protection plan, no coordinated messaging strategy, no internal framework for managing the pressure that comes with a transcendent star. The league had spent decades hoping for a moment like this, and did almost nothing to prepare for it. Instead, leadership defaulted to what it knew best. Monetize. Tickets surged. Broadcast windows expanded. Sponsors lined up. Every metric exploded. And in the rush to capitalize, the league treated Clark like an asset instead of a responsibility. They sold the attention without managing the consequences. What followed was predictable. Clark became the focal point of everything: admiration, criticism, resentment, and hostility. Physical targeting increased. Narrative manipulation intensified. And the league stayed quiet. That silence mattered. Because when a league fails to protect its most valuable player, it sends a message. Not just to fans, but to players inside the system. It tells them success is tolerated, but not defended. And while Clark absorbed the pressure, something else happened quietly behind the scenes. The league's excuses started collapsing. Years of "we can't afford this" evaporated almost overnight. Not because costs changed, but because attention did. Clark proved something dangerous for a league built on limitations. She proved that money wasn't the barrier. Relevance was. And once relevance arrived, the entire internal logic of the WNBA had to change. The league didn't just gain a superstar. It gained a mirror showing what was possible, a mirror showing what had been withheld, a mirror showing what had been mismanaged. And players saw it too. They saw the arenas filling, the ratings surging, the media scrambling, and most importantly, they saw the league respond instantly to demands it had denied for years. That realization rewired expectations forever. Because when one player unlocks resources that were supposedly impossible to access, it creates a dangerous assumption that those resources were always there. Clark didn't just raise the ceiling. She shattered the floor. And once that happens, you can't ask people to crawl again. But the most disruptive part of her arrival wasn't the money. It was what happened next. Because within weeks, the league made a decision that proved everything players had been told before wasn't entirely true. A decision that confirmed Clark had changed the rules. And once that line was crossed, the WNBA entered territory it could no longer control. For years, WNBA players had been told the same thing, over and over again. Charter flights weren't realistic. Too expensive. Not sustainable. Something the league aspired to, but couldn't responsibly provide. Safety concerns were acknowledged, but framed as unfortunate trade-offs of a growing league. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. And suddenly, everything the league said was impossible became mandatory. Within weeks of her draft, the WNBA announced a full-time charter flight program. Every team, every game, regular season and playoffs. No exceptions. Just like that, the announcement sent a shockwave through the league. Not because players didn't want charter flights, they had been asking for them for years, but because the timing shattered trust. What players heard wasn't progress. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the league could afford it all along, or at least could afford it when it mattered. This wasn't just a logistical change. It was a psychological rupture. Years of denials were rewritten in real time. And when that happens, people stop questioning whether demands are reasonable. They start questioning why they were ever denied in the first place. Clark's arrival didn't just raise revenue. It reframed reality. It told players that attention equals action, that pressure works, that once the spotlight is bright enough, the league will move mountains overnight. And that lesson spread faster than any policy memo. Inside locker rooms, conversations shifted. Expectations hardened. The language changed. It wasn't someday. It was why not now. The league didn't anticipate this reaction. Leadership saw the charter decision as a win, a sign of growth and modernization. Players saw it as proof that the league's limits had been selectively enforced. Both sides thought they were right, but only one side felt empowered. This is where the tension stopped being subtle. Because once players realized the league could pivot instantly for one star, every previous compromise started to feel like manipulation. And while Clark never asked for this dynamic, she became its catalyst. Her presence made it impossible for leadership to argue from scarcity anymore. The league had crossed its own red line. And once scarcity disappears as a negotiating tool, leverage shifts permanently. This is the moment entitlement quietly replaced patience. Not out of greed, but out of revelation. Players didn't suddenly become unreasonable. They became aware. Aware that the league responds to urgency, not loyalty. To spotlight, not time served. To money, not messaging. That awareness shaped everything that followed. Because once people believe the ceiling has been artificially lowered, they stop asking for fairness. They demand parity. And the league wasn't ready for that demand. Clark had unintentionally created a standard the WNBA couldn't walk back. And instead of building a framework around that new reality, leadership tried to manage it on the fly, which only made things worse. Because when expectations rise faster than structure, chaos follows. And that chaos didn't just affect negotiations. It reshaped how players viewed each other. It reshaped how stars were perceived. And it set the stage for a dangerous myth to take hold. The idea that Caitlin Clark was just one of many equal stars. A myth that would fuel resentment, distort reality, and push the league even closer to the edge. As Caitlin Clark's impact became impossible to ignore, the league and its media partners leaned hard into a comforting idea. That this wasn't about one player. That the WNBA was finally entering an era of multiple equal stars. A rising tide lifting all boats. a league no longer dependent on a single name. On paper, that narrative sounded healthy. In reality, it was dangerous. Because pretending all stars are equal doesn't make it true. It just hides imbalance until it explodes. Clark's numbers weren't just strong. They were categorically different. Attendance spikes followed her city to city. Viewership surged when she played and dipped when she didn't. Entire broadcast schedules bent around her presence. This wasn't subjective. It was measurable. Yet instead of acknowledging that reality, the league chose symmetry over truth. Angel Reese brought attention, yes. Paige Buchers arrived with hype, yes. Other players benefited from increased exposure. But none of them moved the needle the way Clark did, and the data showed it clearly. The problem wasn't that other players weren't talented. The problem was that talent and market pull aren't the same thing. By refusing to acknowledge that distinction, the league unintentionally fueled resentment. Because when one player's gravity is minimized publicly, it creates tension privately. Players begin to feel their contributions are being overshadowed, not by the star herself, but by the system built around her. And Clark became the symbol of something she never tried to be. The league's dependence. Media framing made it worse. Every conversation turned into comparison. Rivalries were exaggerated. Narratives were forced. And instead of letting Clark exist as a singular phenomenon, she was folded into a manufactured equality that no one truly believed. That disconnect bred frustration. Players didn't resent Clark for her success. They resented what her success revealed. How replaceable the league had told them they all were until one person proved otherwise. The idea of multiple equal stars wasn't meant to empower. It was meant to diffuse pressure. Pressure on leadership to protect its most valuable asset. Pressure on the league to admit dependence. Pressure on negotiations that suddenly had a focal point. By spreading attention thin, the league hoped to stabilize internally. Instead, it destabilized emotionally. Because when players know the truth but are asked to perform a fiction, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, narratives turn toxic. That toxicity didn't stay abstract. It spilled into fandom. It spilled into discourse. And eventually, it spilled onto the court, which is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because when resentment can't be expressed structurally, it finds personal targets. And Caitlin Clark became that target, not just as a player, but as a symbol of change that arrived too fast, a symbol of inequality no one wanted to name, a symbol of a league forced to confront its own contradictions. And once fans entered that conflict, everything escalated. Because the moment fandom becomes politicized, the league loses control of its narrative entirely. And that's when the situation stops being about basketball. It becomes about identity, about blame, about deflection, and about who pays the price when a system refuses to tell the truth. Which brings us to the moment when everything turned openly hostile, and the league's silence became impossible to defend. At some point, the conversation around Caitlin Clark stopped being about basketball. It stopped being about shots made, records broken, or crowds drawn. It became something far more dangerous, a culture war the league never planned for and never controlled. As Clark's popularity exploded, so did the intensity of her fan base. New viewers flooded in. Casual fans. First-time watchers. People who had never paid attention to the WNBA before suddenly cared deeply. That kind of rapid growth always brings friction. But instead of channeling it, the league let it rot. Criticism of Clark on the court escalated into physical targeting. Fouls became harder. Contact became deliberate. And the line between competition and hostility blurred, often without consequence. What players noticed wasn't just the contact. It was the silence. No strong statements. No clear enforcement. No consistent protection. The league watched its most valuable player absorb punishment while benefiting from the attention she generated. That silence spoke louder than any press release. Meanwhile, discourse online spiraled. Fans were categorized. Motives were assumed. Support for Clark was reframed as something sinister instead of something organic. Instead of separating bad actors from genuine supporters, entire groups were labeled. And once labeling begins, accountability disappears. This wasn't about defending players from harassment. It became about deflecting responsibility. By shifting the conversation toward fandom toxicity, the league avoided confronting its own failures. Failures to protect. Failures to manage growth. Failures to acknowledge dependency. Clark became the lightning rod. And when resentment has no outlet at the negotiating table, it finds one in narrative warfare. Players spoke out, but often selectively, condemning fans while ignoring on-court behavior, calling for accountability while benefiting from the exposure Clark brought. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed. Fans began to question motives. Players felt misunderstood. The league stayed quiet, and that silence turned tension into fracture. Because once players start seeing fans as enemies, and fans start seeing players as opportunists, the ecosystem breaks down. Trust collapses. The league wasn't just losing control of its narrative. It was losing control of its identity. What should have been a celebration of growth became a battlefield of resentment. And Clark, intentionally or not, stood at the center of it. Not because she asked to, but because the league allowed it. This is the moment when things stopped being reversible. Because while fandom conflicts can cool down, financial revelations don't. And just as this cultural tension reached its peak, the league dropped a number so massive it rewired every negotiation overnight. A number that changed how players viewed their worth. A number that erased patience entirely. And a number that made the coming standoff inevitable. Because once you tell people there's billions on the table, you can't ask them to settle for scraps. And that's when the real fight began. When the WNBA announced its new media rights deal, it didn't just make headlines. It changed psychology. $2.2 billion. Spread across 11 years. Disney, Amazon Prime Video, NBC Universal, legacy media and tech giants lining up to bet on women's basketball. For the first time in league history, the WNBA wasn't pitching itself as a passion project. It was being sold as a legitimate commercial product. And the moment players heard that number, something snapped. Because numbers like that don't feel abstract. They feel personal. The previous media deal was modest, limited, quiet, a reflection of where the league had been. This one was different. This one existed only because 2024 forced the sports world to pay attention. And everyone inside the league knew why. The timing wasn't subtle. The explosion in viewership, the packed arenas, the national conversations, the draft ratings that rivaled major men's sports events. None of it happened by accident. This deal didn't materialize out of patience. It materialized out of impact. And Caitlin Clark was at the center of that impact, whether the league wanted to say it publicly or not. So when players saw that number, they didn't see growth. They saw withheld value. They started doing math. If the league could suddenly secure billions, then the old arguments collapsed. Revenue sharing percentages looked outdated. Salary structures felt insulting. Long-term patience felt unnecessary. And that's when the Players Association made its move. Opting out of the existing CBA wasn't just a negotiation tactic. It was a declaration, a signal that the balance of power had shifted, or at least that players believed it had. This is where the disconnect deepened. From the player perspective, the logic was simple. The league is richer than ever. The spotlight is brighter than ever. The risk profile has changed. So compensation should change immediately. From the league's perspective, it wasn't that simple. Media deals are projections, not cash in hand. Long-term commitments tied to performance, delivery, and sustained interest. Remove the core attraction, and the valuation changes instantly. That's the part players didn't want to hear. Because once expectations are set by a massive number, nuance feels like betrayal. This is the moment negotiations stopped being collaborative. They became confrontational. Demands escalated quickly. Revenue share increases. Guaranteed contracts. Salary cap elimination. Unrestricted free agency. Structural overhauls that assumed continued growth at Clark-level momentum. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That leverage didn't exist without her. The irony is brutal. The very player whose presence unlocked the deal wasn't the one driving the demands. And yet she became the silent foundation those demands rested on. And while players pushed harder, the league grew quieter. Because leadership understood something dangerous. If Clark's position ever changed, if she got hurt, burned out, or chose a different path, the entire financial narrative collapses. That $2.2 billion suddenly looks optimistic. Suddenly fragile. Suddenly risky. And that's why the timing of the opt-out terrified ownership. Not because players wanted more, but because they wanted it now, without acknowledging what made it possible. But the players believed they had leverage beyond Clark. They believed the league had alternatives. They believed the momentum was permanent. So they looked elsewhere for bargaining power. And that's where the next move came in. a move designed to shift control. A move meant to prove the WNBA wasn't the only option. A move that was supposed to scare the league. Instead, it exposed the truth. Because when that alternative launched, it revealed just how dependent everything still was on one name. And once that illusion shattered, the entire negotiation landscape changed again. When Unrivaled was announced, it wasn't framed as competition. It was framed as freedom. A player-driven league. Domestic off-season opportunities. A way to keep talent stateside instead of overseas. On the surface, it sounded like empowerment, progress, evolution. But beneath that messaging sat a much sharper intention. Unrivaled wasn't just basketball. It was leverage. The concept was simple. If WNBA players had an alternative, even a 3-on-3 format, it weakened the league's negotiating position. It gave players options. And options change power dynamics. At least, that was the theory. The problem was execution. When Unrivaled launched, the numbers didn't match the ambition. Ratings were low. Interest was inconsistent. Engagement lagged. The product didn't capture casual fans. It didn't pull mainstream attention. And it didn't move the needle the way its creators hoped. The contrast was brutal. Caitlin Clark's regular season games were pulling over 1 million viewers. Unrivaled struggled to break a fraction of that on its best nights. And the most damaging part wasn't the ratings themselves. It was who wasn't there. Clark declined involvement. That decision mattered more than any press release. Because Unrivaled didn't just need talent. It needed gravity. It needed someone who could bring eyeballs beyond the core fan base. And without Clark, it didn't have that pull. Suddenly, the leverage play flipped. Instead of proving players had alternatives, it proved something else entirely. That the ecosystem still revolved around one person. The league the players hoped would strengthen their position ended up reinforcing the WNBA's most uncomfortable truth. Remove Clark, and interest drops dramatically. Unrivaled didn't fail because it was poorly intentioned. It failed because it exposed dependency. And once that dependency became obvious, the illusion of collective leverage collapsed. Because if alternatives can't survive without the same star, then the power never actually shifted. It just moved temporarily. Which brings us to the current moment. A league deadlocked. A players' association pushing harder than ever. And one player quietly holding all the real cards, whether she wants to or not. Here's the reality the WNBA is dancing around. Without Caitlin Clark, none of this looks the same. Not the charter flights. Not the media deal. Not the mainstream attention. Not the negotiating posture. Not the confidence players suddenly feel. Clark didn't just elevate the league. She redefined what players believed was possible. And belief is powerful, but it can also be dangerous when it's disconnected from reality. The Players Association is negotiating as if the league's momentum is permanent. As if interest will continue regardless of who's on the court. As if fans are loyal to the logo instead of the story. History says otherwise. Sports leagues don't grow linearly. They spike around moments, personalities, and narratives. Lose those, and numbers regress fast. Clark is that moment. And unlike most players, she has options. She doesn't need the WNBA financially. She doesn't need it for exposure. She doesn't need it for relevance. Endorsements alone put her in a different category. Overseas leagues could triple her salary. Media opportunities could replace game checks entirely. The WNBA needs her far more than she needs it. That imbalance is the quiet panic behind closed doors. Because while players push for structural overhauls, leadership knows the risk profile has never been higher. If Clark gets hurt, if she burns out, if she decides the environment isn't worth it, the entire financial house of cards wobbles. And that's what makes the current strategy so dangerous. The league is negotiating like it's diversified. It isn't. The players are demanding like the league is bulletproof. It isn't. And Clark is being asked to absorb pressure, criticism, and hostility while everyone else cashes in on what she built. That's not empowerment. That's exploitation with better branding. Here's the question nobody wants to confront. What incentive does Caitlin Clark actually have to stay? She brings the ratings. She brings the money. She brings the relevance. And in return, she gets silence when she's targeted, deflection when fans are labeled, and resentment from people benefiting directly from her presence. That's not a sustainable equation. Clark didn't create this environment intentionally, but she's being forced to live inside it. Every negotiation escalates because of her. Every demand rests on her impact. Every projection assumes her continued presence. Yet she's treated like just another piece in the system. That contradiction wears people down. And unlike most players, Clark doesn't have to tolerate it. If she leaves, the consequences are immediate. Broadcast expectations collapse. Sponsorship enthusiasm cools. Media narratives shift. The $2.2 billion deal suddenly looks very expensive for content that doesn't deliver the same engagement. The league knows this, which is why this moment matters so much. Because the WNBA isn't just negotiating contracts. It's negotiating trust. And right now it's losing. This is the crossroads. One path leads to alignment, recognizing that protecting, elevating, and supporting the league's most valuable asset isn't favoritism. It's survival. The other path leads to resentment-driven demands, internal fractures, and the slow erosion of relevance once the spotlight fades. Caitlin Clark gave the WNBA something it had never truly possessed before. Not visibility, not talent, but mainstream cultural gravity. The kind that pulls in casual fans. The kind that attracts real money. The kind that changes how a league is perceived overnight. That kind of gravity is rare. And it doesn't last forever. If the League and Players Association fail to recognize what moment they're standing in, history will remember 2024 not as the beginning of something lasting, but as a missed opportunity. Because lightning doesn't strike twice. And once it's gone, no amount of negotiation will bring it back. If you want real breakdowns of what's actually happening behind the scenes in sports, not PR narratives, not media spin, not watered-down takes, make sure you subscribe. Because the next moves the WNBA makes will determine whether this league builds something sustainable or watches its biggest moment fade faster than anyone expected. And trust me, this story is far from over.